We got the Pope, and then we got the midterms. Any questions, comments, or concerns before I begin?
No, those are my two favorite topics, so that's great.
Not baseball.
The Pope was baseball. That was a huge thing. Did you guys, was this just my universe?
Oh, yeah, there was false reporting that he was a Cubs fan,
Yeah.
and in fact, he's a White Sox fan.
From ABC.
Yikes. Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk, and America got its first Pope. I was actually sitting next to one of about 30 Indiana University study abroad students on my flight back from Madrid on Saturday, and my seatmate told me that her whole dorm was live streaming the smoke from the Sistine Chapel. As she recounted, everyone went crazy when, quote, America won. You absolutely love to see it. Anyway, I'm back from vacation.
USA.
Anyway, I'm back from vacation. Thanks for bearing with me, and buckle up because we are back to 2 episodes this week. Today, we're going to talk about the Pope and do our first ever look ahead to the 2026 midterms. And I'm not just interested in the Pope as part of this podcast's religious community revival agenda. I'm kidding here. I'm interested in the Pope because for the first time ever, he's a registered voter in Illinois. So we've got some receipts from his primary voting record, as well as his subtweets on social media. Pop off King, or should I say pop off Pope? Or maybe it's just Pope off. Okay. Sorry, Nathaniel's looking at me with shame in his eyes. And some big Republican names are sitting out marquee 2026 Senate races. Last week, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp said he's declining to challenge Jon Ossoff, meaning the party is missing out on its strongest recruit for perhaps its strongest pickup prospect. Last month, Chris Sununu also declined to run for New Hampshire's open Senate seat. So how are things shaping up so far for next year's midterms? Here with me to discuss our two dear friends of the podcast who you have already heard from, snickering as I made some bad jokes. Thank you for joining me, Mary Radcliffe. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Galen, how you doing?
You know, I'm doing pretty well. Got
Refreshed
that vacation
after a little vacation?
something like that. It was a rowdy 2 weeks adventure pack. Lived through a nationwide blackout. Got stranded in some different places.
We had blackouts in Pittsburgh too.
Wait, really?
That's true.
There was a huge storm. Yeah. Oh yeah. I had no power for 2 days.
Oh, good. Okay, it wasn't a whole week like they were.
No, some of my friends was a whole week.
Yikes.
Then we can relate. Did you have cash and a stocked refrigerator?
Well, I tried not to open the refrigerator the whole time.
Yeah, we got caught in an Airbnb with pretty much no cash and no food. So, but the power came back on within 12 hours. So it was more a panicking about what could be as opposed to what was.
Are you a prepper now?
I am a prepper, at least with cash. You know, you got to take some cash out of the ATM and hide it somewhere or bring it on vacation.
I do have cash in my safe.
Mary, if I had to pick a prepper on this podcast, if I had to pick somebody with a safe on this podcast, it would be you.
Well,
I think that's just because I'm generally irresponsible, so.
Well, okay. Should I say on the podcast? I have a safe because I have a firearm, and you have to be responsible with those kinds of
Mary,
things.
there's no shame in having a firearm on this podcast.
No, I'm an American.
We respect the Second Amendment on this podcast.
Did you guys know that Kamala Harris has a gun?
I think I might have heard something along. Okay, I was gonna tweet. So I've been going through this experience of now that I can say whatever I want theoretically, especially now today because Nathaniel, congratulations, this is our first work day in many years not on the Walt Disney Company payroll because technically last Friday was our last day at ABC News. I'm thinking what can I say now that I'm off the payroll? And I was gonna tweet something that was I see Substack the way I see guns, which is I was never going to be the first, but you won't find me the last idiot without one if everyone's getting one.
Do you have firearms, Galen?
I come from a family that has plenty of firearms, but I don't have one. And I live in New York City where you really can't. I mean, you probably shouldn't, but you also can't have a firearm in most places. I got a Substack. I still don't have my own gun, but I know where I could find one if I needed one. Anyway, Nathaniel, welcome to the podcast. Congratulations on your first day off the Disney payroll in many years.
First day
How's
on the
it feel?
unemployment line. Congratulations to you too, Galen.
Great shout out moment. If you are not yet a paid subscriber to the GD Politics podcast, this is a great moment to do it.
Yes.
Keep me off the government dime if you can.
Yeah, Galen is gonna leech your taxpayer dollars. He's gonna suck you dry.
I am getting on food stamps and I am buying Diet Coke immediately.
And iPhones. Don't forget the iPhones.
You get your Obama phone.
Wait, am I missing a political reference here? Was buying an iPhone with food stamps a thing?
Yeah, isn't it?
Wait, you can buy iPhones with food stamps?
No,
it was the Obama phone thing where like Obama had this program to provide smartphones for people who needed them because for a lot of people it's the only way to access the internet. And then other people freaked out about that.
Oh, okay. I totally missed that. But anyway.
Is this going to be a loose one, you guys? Jeez, oh, Pete.
I'm afraid it might be. This is all staying in. Now that I'm editing myself, I can't be cutting through every little, tangent that we go on. But Nathaniel, how are you feeling? Is there anything that you would like to promote now that we are in the breadline?
That's a good question. No, I'm good.
Are you serious? Okay,
I would
Nathaniel
like to promote
at least has a
peace,
Substack.
Love, and
you the new American Pope?
Opportunity.
Woke
I am.
Marxist Nathaniel.
Woke Marxist Nathaniel.
Woke Marxist Nathaniel. Anyway.
That was a reference to, Mary, can you explain why Nathaniel was just singing?
Yeah, so there was a tweet from Laura Loomer that this is a woke Marxist Pope. And then someone else who I don't remember who it was retweeted that you sing that to the tune of the Pink Pony Club, which will immediately get stuck in your head. Yeah, exactly right.
Woke Marxist Pope. What's the next line of that song? Catch me at the woke Marxist Pope. Anyway.
Somebody needs to write I'm sure somebody's already done this, right?
Oh, yeah.
Rewritten all of the lyrics to fit with Robert Provost.
The Song a Day guy, the guy who writes a song every single day, used to be a podcast listener. If you are out there, please write woke Marxist Pope to the tune of Pink Pony Club. Anyway, Mary, is there anything you would like to promote since we're offering the opportunity?
Not yet. Ask me next time.
Ooh, okay. All right. Stay tuned. Okay, let's get to the actual topics at hand. Welcome back from vacation, I guess as a loose one. I hope everyone enjoyed the tangents. But the Pope is a registered voter in Illinois. He's also been active on social media, as I mentioned. So, Nathaniel, what do we know about him based on his, at least Illinois registration and the voting information we have on him?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So folks should know that even though who you vote for is not public knowledge, obviously we have a secret ballot in this country, the fact that you have voted is look upable. And people immediately did this with the Pope when they were like, oh, he's American. What are we going to do? I also personally went straight to the FEC to be like, has he donated any money to candidates? The answer is no. But yeah, some folks looked him up on the Illinois voter roll and found that he has voted. I think the most interesting thing is that he voted in the Republican primaries in Illinois in 2012, 2014, and 2016, but not any primaries since then.
Wait, also, he did vote in Democratic primaries before that.
Oh, okay. I missed that. Mm-hmm. All right. Interesting.
He
Do you know what
voted
years?
In Democratic primaries, I believe, yes, in 2008 and 2010, according to the New York Times. So we have a bipartisan Pope.
Well, okay.
I mean, I don't know, like whatever primary you vote on isn't necessarily indicative of your partisanship, right? Like,
exactly.
I always vote in Democratic primaries because I live in a city where the Democratic primary is the election, regardless of whether or not I would consider myself a Democrat, which I don't. Like, I still want to be able to choose my mayor.
You're a gun-owning church lady. You're not a Democrat, Mary.
Right. But yeah, that's a really important point. And the I think it's important because a lot of people were claiming, like Charlie Kirk and stuff, were claiming, oh, he's a registered Republican in Illinois. And Illinois does not have party registration. Some states register by party, others don't. And in Illinois, it's just you are unregistered with a party and you pick which party's primary to vote in. And so it's interesting that he voted in the 2010 Democratic primary in Illinois, because that was a very competitive Democratic primary for governor between Pat Quinn and Dan Hines. And then in 2014, there was also a competitive Republican primary for governor that Bruce Rauner ultimately won. And so I think it makes sense for why he voted in those. And obviously in 2008, there was a contested Democratic primary for president. In 2012 and in 2016, there were contested Republican primaries for president. So he did seem to be somewhat of a strategic voter.
Oh, yeah.
What I think to be
politically savvy Pope.
Exactly. What I find to be interesting, though, is that he hasn't voted in primaries since then. And in fact, he really did not vote a lot, although he did vote absentee in the general election in 2024. But the fact that, they think there have been a lot of people who, who have maybe left the Republican Party or been less interested in the Republican Party since 2016, since the election of one Donald J. Trump. We also know from his social media presence, as you mentioned, Galen, that he retweeted some things that were critical of the Trump administration's immigration policies. He retweeted an article that was basically J.D. Vance is wrong about Catholicism. And so I think a lot of people are assuming that this may be a little bit of an anti-Trump, never-Trumper Pope, which could be interesting.
Has he ever written for the Bulwark?
Get Sarah Longwell on the horn.
Okay, so there has been some speculation about his political leanings, both as pertains to American politics specifically, but also as pertains to church teachings, which we'll get into. But I have one more logistical question about his voter registration now that he is the head of state of another country. So first of all, can you be dual citizens between the Vatican and the United States? And can he still vote in U.S. elections as the head of state of the Vatican?
The Vatican's laws may be specific or have, because obviously this has been the case before. Pope Francis was a citizen of Argentina, so presumably it won't be an issue for them. But here in the U.S., you can be a dual citizen. You can even be the head of another state. It is definitely weird, but it has happened before. Actually, the former president of Somalia was a naturalized U.S. citizen. And as far if you are a citizen of the United States, you can vote. So yes, theoretically, the Pope could vote in the midterms in the 2026 Democratic primary for Senate in Illinois if he wanted to, which we will discuss maybe later on this podcast. But my guess is, I think given that he has fallen off the voter history map, according to the records that people dug up, I'm guessing that he will probably abstain, and that is maybe the proper thing to do, is to stay above politics. But he has that right if he wants to use it.
God, can you imagine if we have to follow Pope endorsement news?
Well, I mean, as a cardinal and as now Pope, he will endorse different ideas about Catholicism and different worldviews. What do we know about that, Mary? I mean, there are hot-button issues within the church that are things like homosexuality and women in leadership, but then there are also more hot-button-y issues in politics that the church frequently will weigh in on, like war or immigration or even climate change now.
Yeah, and you did hear a little bit from him in his first Sunday address yesterday, talking about things like the various international conflicts that we have going on right now, seeming to at least mildly side, for example, with the Ukrainians in the conflict in Ukraine, talking about humanitarian aid in Gaza. So you do see already in his very first address some slight leanings toward, at least with respect to international conflict, what we generally think of as the left position in the United States. To the extent that he'll be involved in other hot-button issues with the United States, I think we're going to have to wait and see. I mean, one of the tricky things that the Pope has to contend with is that opinions about some of those issues in the United States, among American Catholics, among European Catholics, may not necessarily be representative of opinions of Catholics as a whole. So I was trying to figure this out, and I found this survey that Ben Dixon and Amandi did for Univision in 2013 and 2014. It's about a year after Francis became Pope. This was a global survey of Catholics, and we can quibble about the methodology. I have quibbles about the methodology. But in that survey, when you look at Catholics globally, there's some sort of differences between what you would see among American or European Catholics. So globally, like 2/3 of Catholics still opposed gay marriage in that survey. Granted, that was 10 years ago, so maybe things have shifted somewhat since then. But as the head of the Catholic Church, it's not just about what American politics is going to reflect or the kinds of issues we're talking about here. American Catholics are more supportive of gay marriage than global Catholics. That's true. American Catholics are more supportive of popes being able to get married, for example, than global Catholics. So there's a balancing act here, I think, for any pope between sort of Catholics in the global North versus the global South.
Yeah, for sure. In fact, in a more recent YouGov CBS poll that polled American Catholics only, so we don't have a comparison point, but a majority of U.S. Catholics said that the next pope, this was before he was selected, should support the use of birth control, should support women becoming priests, and priests getting married. A majority said the pope should oppose the death penalty, same-sex marriage, and abortion. And from, I think, what we understand, this new pope, Pope Leo, does oppose same-sex marriage, or has at least talked about, in a 2012 address, he expressed concern that Western culture promotes, quote, enormous sympathy for beliefs and practices that are at odds with the gospel, specifically referencing abortion, the homosexual lifestyle, and alternative families comprised of same-sex partners and their adopted children. I'm reading from NPR reporting here. Obviously, the world has changed since 2012 quite a bit.
You know who else opposed gay marriage in 2012?
Barack Obama.
Right.
And Hillary Clinton.
I think
maybe that was the year she switched.
That was the year that Obama switched, in fairness. But I think it's important to note that, yes, the world has changed, but also, like, it's the Pope. Like, I think there is an urge to fit the Pope, especially this American Pope, into, is he a Democrat or is he a Republican, when not accounting for the fact that, like, actually, like, the way that we have organized our parties is not necessarily the way that it's not necessarily ideologically consistent. It's not necessarily the way that people in other countries, to Mary's point, think about things. So, like, the Pope, basically, like, these, like, really Catholic people, like heads of the Catholic Church, people who really believe in church doctrine, you're going to be really conservative on some issues like abortion and like probably, LGBT rights, but you might also be liberal on other issues like immigration or climate change, and like that isn't necessarily inconsistent. Right, exactly, or the death penalty. And so I think we just kind of have to, people are like, oh, like there's an important difference between like liberal Catholics and conservative Catholics in terms of the leadership of the church. Obviously, Francis was progressive and brought the church in that direction. But I think by American standards, pretty much all these people are going to fit into that quadrant of like conservative on some issues and liberal on some issues.
Well, and I think there's a fundamental distinction here too when we talk about like progressive in the sense of the church, right? Like politically progressive and theologically progressive are two different things. They're not totally orthogonal, I would say, but I think that like this idea of like progressivism as a political project needs to be somewhat separate from progressivism as a theological project, which is more about biblical interpretation.
Yeah, I mentioned, Mary, that you're a church lady. Offhandedly, you do identify as a church lady. And so I'm curious what you mean by that. But also, I wanted to ask, as pertains to American politics, which way do views run on things like homosexuality or abortion or immigration? Like, would Pope Leo blessing gays make people in America less bigoted towards gay people? Would his refusal make them more? And also on immigration, he's already spoken out on immigration. Will the Pope just saying, we should take in, refugees or whatever, make conservative American Catholics change their minds? Like, what's the directionality on views here?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I am a church lady. I am not Catholic. I'm Presbyterian. So the extent to which the Pope might influence the thinking of American Catholics, I don't actually know, right? Like my instinct as an observer of American politics is that you would get a lot of people yelling on social media and not a lot of actual minds changed if the Pope were to do something that conservative American Catholics were unhappy with. That's my prior on this.
That kind of makes sense from the polling as well. It seems like Americans, even when the Pope sort of takes a political or theological position see the Pope as above politics. So 76% of American Catholics approved of Pope Francis's leadership of the church, even though American Catholics lean more towards Trump, about 60-40 in the past election, and Francis was quite progressive, and in fact very progressive on the thing that Trump is most conservative on, which is immigration. And so I don't think people are viewing it the same way as like Laura Loomer, who called him a woke Marxist Pope, or like Steve Bannon for that matter. But before we wrap up here, and we have plenty to get to in the midterms, I'm curious what you did mean by that, Mary, the difference between theological progressivism and political progressivism, even from a Presbyterian perspective.
Well, I do attend a theologically progressive church. So when we talk about theological progressivism, there is a difference in how a theological progressive would interpret scripture. So progressive theology would take into account, for example, the historical context in which pieces of scripture were written, rather than interpret it as like iron word of God. There's a recognition here.
It's like the Supreme Court.
Yes, there's a recognition here that divinely inspired words were written by human beings existing in context and should be considered within that context in order to best interpret them, to best understand the will of God, things of that nature, right? Rather than like pure textualism, like you would in the Supreme Court, if you want to take that analogy. So it is actually similar in that way in terms of interpretation of old written words. How do we think about them? How do we understand them, either in their context, as we would in a progressive approach, or as the text, as you would in a sort of more conservative approach. So there's a recognition that humans have shaped the word of God over time, and that it is up to humans to then interpret what those humans did in the past. That would be like the first point of disagreement, I think, between like people who believe the Bible is the literal word of God, every word, which we would say is a pretty conservative interpretation, and what I would think of as a theologically progressive interpretation.
So we shouldn't really be comparing the new pope to, say, right or left, like Trump or Kamala. We should be comparing him to like Alito or Kagan.
I guess. I mean, listen, like there's a wrinkle here with the Catholic Church. And I will say, like, for the millionth time, I am not Catholic. Please do not come at me, Catholics. But there's a wrinkle here in the Catholic Church, which is that there is, in fact, an official structure for interpreting scripture, and that is the Pope, right? So like,
the Pope.
That's the role of the head of the church, is to interpret scripture for the laity. And so that's a very different thing than the way I would think about this as a Protestant, where you have different types of Protestantism, different types of structures, some top down, some bottom up. It's all over the place. So there's sort of a lot more room for these kinds of conversations about how to think about interpreting scripture.
I keep having on non-Catholics when we talk about papal politics. I, for my own part, am half Catholic, or was raised half Catholic, but I don't know all of this stuff. So I think we're eventually going to have a database Catholic journalist on the podcast.
When I was 18, I took a confirmation class at a Catholic church. And I told the guy leading the class, I'm like, listen, I'm not Catholic and I'm not going to become Catholic. I'm just really curious about this. I just want to understand how things are different. And he was like, okay, I bet you'll become Catholic by the end of it. Sorry, my friend.
And she's still a Protestant. Once a contrarian, always a contrarian. Anyway, we'll see how often we make it back to papal politics in the future. But thank you for indulging me today, Mary and Nathaniel. Let's move on and talk about the midterms, but first, a break. Today's podcast is brought to you by you, the listener. I'm in the early stages of getting this podcast off the ground, and it will only succeed with your support. I want to bring you coverage that embraces curiosity, rigor, and a sense of humor. And I want to bring it to you on a regular basis with more episodes, more insight, and more laughs. I can only do that if you subscribe to and support this podcast. Go to gdpolitics.com and become a paid subscriber today. Even better, do it right now. gdpolitics.com, that's G as in gosh, D as in darn, and politics as in that hot mess. Head to gdpolitics.com to subscribe, and thank you. The race for control of Congress in the midterms next year is starting to take shape. I mentioned that some promising Republicans had declined to run in competitive Senate seats, but I want to talk about the big picture first. Trump's net approval, according to the trackers, is at about -7, -8. That's ticked up slightly. He's doing a little bit better than he was right around the 100-day mark. Maybe it's not a total coincidence that he's also undone some of the levies that he put on trade during that time, and the stock market has reacted positively. We can talk about that if you like. But also the generic ballot polling average. We don't have as much polling on the generic ballot, but that's asking Americans, if the election were today for Congress, would you vote for a Republican or a Democrat? That's Democrat +2 on average. So pretty good for Democrats, but not great. And I'm curious, as a starting question, Mary or Nathaniel, dive in, whoever's more raring to go on this. Which of those numbers do you think is more predictive of how the midterms will go in your mind? Which is, one is saying things are really not very good for Trump, and the other one is saying things are kind of good, but not great for Democrats.
Well, they're actually both saying that things are pretty good for Democrats, and this is why.
Well, I mean, yes, they are, but like one is saying things are great, and the other one is saying things are decent. No? Or maybe I'm wrong.
Because, okay, so there is a weak relationship between the president's approval rating and how many seats his party loses in the midterms. So that's not worthless, but it is a weak relationship. The generic ballot is much stronger. So if you look at final generic ballot polls, so like the ones taken in November of 2026 in this case, the relationship is basically like 1-to-1. I think the correlation was like 0.9. So generic ballot polling is very good at predicting the House popular vote, I should say, which obviously is heavily correlated with the results of the House elections. We are not in November 2026 at this time, of course, but the trend historically has been that generic ballot polling gets worse for the president's party. So when I wrote an article on this in 2022, I did it in September of the odd year and found that on average, the president's party, the generic ballot gets an average of 4 points worse for the president's party between September of the odd year and the following November. I think that's, we're not that far away from September at this point, but I think you can, again, like this is a clear historical trend. We know that the president's party does badly in midterms, and it tends to get worse for them over time as honeymoons wear off, et cetera. And, the opposition party kind of hones its pitch. And I think, the D+2 generic ballot right now, very easily, I think we would expect it based on historical trends to turn into something like D+6 by the time voting happens, maybe even worse. In 2018, it was D+9. Obviously, that was Trump's first midterm as well. So I think at the end of the day, we are pointing toward another kind of, good Democratic midterm like we saw in 2018.
Yeah, so I think there's actually one really interesting thing happening with the generic ballot right now that is a little unusual historically. So I went back a couple of weeks ago and looked at the generic ballot in midterm years, considering the advantage or disadvantage for the out of power party. Now, what normally happens is that right after an election, when people are asked the generic ballot question, they still say they're going to vote for the party they just voted for. Like they haven't changed their mind yet. So it takes some time, as Nathaniel was saying, for the polling to move toward the opposition party. What's really fast, there's one exception to this, I should say, which is the 2018 midterms. Even in very early 2017, the resistance was like running full steam. The Dems had an advantage from the get-go. What's fascinating to me about what's happening right now is that you did see this in January. So in January and February, Republicans were ahead in the generic ballot by 5 points in January on average, by 2 points or so in February on average. That's moved toward the Democrats already, which is something we have never seen historically in the data I was able to analyze. Now, I should say—
Outside of 2018.
Yeah, outside of 2018. But even in 2018, there was really no movement on the generic ballot in those first few months, right? It was just pretty stable. Yeah. This is the only year, and to be clear, I only had enough data to analyze going back to the 2010 midterms, because prior to that, there just simply wasn't enough generic ballot polling to do this sort of analysis. But this is the first time since that 2010 midterm that we're seeing the generic ballot already moving in the first 100 days of the presidency. So I don't really know what that means. It could mean that the Democrats
might mean somebody started a trade war and tanked the stock market.
Yeah.
Well, and so then my question is that cannibalizing that eventual 4-point movement you see from September? Or
Mary, that's smart.
Is that going to be that plus another 4 points of movement in September?
Yeah.
I don't actually know. So I think this is going to be an interesting one to watch in terms of how the generic ballot changes over time, because it's already looking pretty different than what we've seen in the past.
That's interesting. I have a question here because, Nathaniel, you're saying this is all good news for Democrats, and that's based on the assumption that we will see some of that movement. I think D+2, you would say, is like okay, but not great for Democrats, if that's what the polling actually showed in November of 2026. However, the Center for Politics at UVA recently published its model for the 2026 midterms, and this is what their calculations suggested. Quote, the results indicate that even a neutral political environment, one in which the two parties are tied on the generic ballot, Republicans would be expected to lose about 13 seats in the House and about 5 seats in the Senate. Losses of that magnitude would give Democrats control of both chambers in the next Congress. Does that seem well calibrated to you? Mary's already smirking.
Well, you asked Nathaniel, so...
Oh, no, I'm asking both of you. I saw smirks from both of you, and I want to know what's behind both of them.
Well, so this is not a model in the way that we think of it as at 538, right? It's not like Crystal Ball is doing a
Oh, there is no 538,
district.
Nathaniel.
Yeah, we think of it at 538. What are you referring to, Nathaniel?
Okay. Fine. Jeez, guys. It's still fresh, okay? No, but like this is a model by political scientist Alan Abramowitz, and it's basically one of these like early political sciencey fundamentals based models, which I think are interesting and kind of directionally get us where we want to go, but should never be taken literally by like seat counts and stuff like that. And the article itself acknowledges this, right, is that it doesn't take into account, for example, which seats are up in the Senate this year. And that is very important because the map is not good for Democrats. And even if they have a D+10 midterm and it's a huge blue wave surpassing 2018, it's not clear where those like 4 seats are going to be for them to flip control of the Senate. So, I think that I don't think anybody should be taking those seat counts literally, but I think it does show that.
But seriously, if not literally.
Yeah, even that. I mean, like in the Senate, I really wouldn't put much stock in it. And again, like the article basically says, like this is just an academic exercise. In the House, it has more of a historical like correlation with the eventual results, and I do think that given the narrow margin for Republicans in the House, like. It should shock no one, and they won the popular vote, right, in the House. Even a D+2 environment, I think, should easily be enough for Democrats to take back the handful of seats that they need. But
you're saying Democrats won the House popular vote in 2024?
No, sorry, Republicans won the House popular vote in 2024. Even if the generic ballot does not move at all, and we have a D+2 midterm, that should be enough for Democrats to pick up the 4 seats that they need in order to take control of the House.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even call this a model. They don't call it a model in that article from the Center for Politics. They call it a regression analysis, which is fine. It is a regression analysis. It is not a forecast model.
Wait, they said generic ballot model gives Democrats strong chance to take back House in 2026. I knew I wasn't making that up.
I mean, when I read the article, they repeatedly said regression analysis. Regression
analysis is not a headline word, Galen.
Yeah. So, I mean,
you won't get the clicks.
I think Nathaniel's spot on here. I think, with respect to the House, because there are so many seats, you can do this sort of regression without having to be super picky about the particular partisanship of each seat. And every seat is up for election. In the Senate, the map is not good. Like, this kind of analysis needs to be a little more sophisticated when we're talking about Senate forecasting. And I totally agree with Nathaniel. They were very clear in this article that, like, this is not our forecast of what's going to happen.
Yeah. So let's be a little more sophisticated when it comes to the Senate for a second. According to Cook Political Report, the toss-ups in the Senate in 2026 are Ossoff's seat in Georgia, and an open seat in Michigan that's being vacated by Democrat Gary Peters. The lean Democrat seats are open seats in New Hampshire and Minnesota that are also being vacated by Democrats. The lean R seats are Susan Collins in Maine and Tom Tillis in North Carolina. Now, obviously, they go into likely and solid, but I don't think we need to get into all of that right now. Broadly, do you agree with those ratings? Are those the, how many is that? 6 seats that are shaping the 2026 race for the Senate? Or would you take some of those away, or would you add any?
I mean, I think that is a great starting point. Without more polling, I think it's pretty difficult to determine if there's going to be any other seats that might end up being competitive that are a little surprising. So, for example, there's a possibility that the special election in Ohio could get a little more competitive. Sherrod Brown has expressed interest in running for that seat. He only lost his last race by about 3.5 points. Not a lot of Ohioans know who John Husted is, who was appointed to fill J.D. Vance's seat when he became vice president. I'm not saying that will or won't be competitive. It could be that the answer is no, it's not. But we only have like one poll of that matchup between Husted and Brown, and it shows it at just like a 3-point margin. That was from Bowling Green State University and YouGov that came out last week. So I don't know what else might be in that column because the polling at this point is pretty thin.
Yeah, it's just really early, right? Like nobody would have predicted that like Nebraska was going to be one of the interesting races in the Senate last year. And so I think it's fair to say that like there'll maybe be a race or two that is going to surprise us. That's going to come out of nowhere because of a strong candidate or some scandal or something like that. But I think based on what we know right now, that is basically the map. But yeah, I mean, I do think that once the cycle rolls around, because I think there is going to be a tendency in, especially if, we're in blue wave territory, I think there's going to be a lot of people being like, ooh, like, can Democrats flip the Senate? And that's going to cause a lot of commentators probably to reach for that, third or fourth seat. And it's not clear what that seat is right now. As Mary mentioned, Ohio, but then like what's after that? Alaska, Iowa. And then I think there's going to be some kind of an effort of like, ooh, is this fourth seat competitive? And then that state will probably get some attention. Like, I think basically the 4 most competitive Republican seats will get a fair amount of attention next year because people know that that's what they need to pay attention to in order to answer the question, will Democrats flip the chamber? Mm-hmm. Right. But like whether that 4th seat is actually competitive or not, I don't know if it will be. But,
so rank the 4 for us.
That we don't know. I think that
it's hard to say at this point.
Clearly, Maine and North Carolina are Democrats' best shots. After that, I think it's like basically pick at random. Like it could be Iowa, it could be Alaska, it could be Ohio.
What if
Kansas.
Kansas?
I was going to say Kansas. Texas. Everyone always wants to talk about Texas.
Yeah, Texas. If Ken Paxton wins the Republican nomination, I think Texas gets competitive in a hurry. But like this just goes to show like it is early. We don't know the candidates yet. The field is still settling into place. We'll see.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, like we just rattled off, or Nathaniel just rattled off a bunch of states. I could see under the right conditions any one of those states being competitive. I could also see under the right conditions absolutely none of them being competitive.
Right.
Another thing that we look at sometimes is just like behavior. How are people behaving like they're expecting a blue wave? Are Republicans retiring from Congress or promising people declining to run? We've already mentioned now Chris Sununu and Brian Kemp. What does that ecosystem look like? Are people behaving like we're in a blue wave environment?
I wouldn't necessarily say so. I think Chris Sununu I think Senate has never really appealed to him. Brian Kemp probably wants to run for president. And if you want to run for president in 2028, a terrible thing to do is run for Senate or something else in 2026. You okay there, Mary? You froze.
Yeah, she froze for me too.
Did her power go out too?
Well, it looks like a light was going off.
A light could be, if her power went off, then maybe her light went off and then the internet died. Yep. Bummer.
Yes, quote from Mary, my power just went out.
That is pretty funny, considering.
We were just talking about a blackout.
About how both Galen and Mary had blackout experiences.
Which means we might not be getting her back for the rest of this podcast, which is sad. But we also made it a decent amount of time with Mary's stellar analysis.
That is true. So, I will say I also, we were originally going to record this at 11:30, but I requested to record it at 10, so I deserve to be congratulated here.
Nathaniel,
for being prescient.
MVP of the podcast. Your trophy's in the mail. Nathaniel, why don't you continue where you left off?
Okay. Brian Kemp probably wants to run for president in 2028, and running for statewide office in 2026 is not a thing you want to do if you're running for president, because it takes time away from that, and then you immediately turn around and run for something new, which makes you look like an opportunist. So yeah, I don't necessarily think that means a lot. And if you look at retirements from the House, it's about equal between Republicans and Democrats right now. So I'm not sure that is. I'm not sure it's really showing up in people's behavior yet. But I also think that people's behavior doesn't dictate whether or not we get a blue wave. It is going to come down to more fundamental things. Candidates can matter, but I think that the generic ballot polling and what Trump does with the trade war, that's what's going to matter.
Which I'm sad. My last question of the podcast was going to be, Mary, I know you love tariffs. Can I get a comment on the news today that Trump is lowering for 90 days the tariffs that he levied on China? Whenever we talk about tariffs, Mary has so much to say.
That's good,
sadly,
I have nothing to say about tariffs.
Sadly, we won't be doing that. But I'm sure we will talk about tariffs in the future on this podcast and likely with Mary. But I do want to ask then, as a final question, I asked you and Mary about Democratic and Republican vulnerabilities in the coming couple years when we first talked together on the GD Politics podcast, which was now about 2 months ago. I know you're a very fundamentals kind of girl, Nathaniel. Has your mental model changed at all over the past 2 months? It's been a pretty news heavy 2 months.
It has, yeah, and I do think the fundamentals, they reign supreme, especially at this point, right? Is that you can maybe convince me that things that happen in the news in September and October of 2026 will materially affect the election results. I have a hard time seeing things that are happening right now affect it. I do think that the state of the economy is going to matter, and that obviously could be affected by the decisions that Trump has made and is making. But I think that when Trump was elected, it was I thought the most likely outcome would be another blue wave election in 2026. We saw that in 2018. It was a little different this year because Trump was actually popular when he took office, which he wasn't when he first took office in 2017. But the laws of political gravity apply to every president. The honeymoon periods end, and basically barring national disasters or some kind of major, like the Lewinsky scandal or something like that, the midterms go badly for the president's party, and especially in an environment where Democrats only need to pick up a handful of seats to take back the House, and the Senate is probably out of reach for them regardless because of the map. I figured in a sense, it's kind of academic whether it is a blue wave year or just a decent year for Democrats, because I think the most likely outcome is that Democrats are going to flip the House. I would be pretty surprised if they don't. Similarly, I think Republicans are going to hold the Senate. I would be pretty surprised if they don't.
In that case, maybe this is a stupid question, but given how much of the Trump agenda seems to be focused on executive orders, how much of a difference would a Democratic House without a Democratic Senate make right now?
Yeah, I think it still matters, right? I haven't given up on our 3-branch system. There are things that only Congress can do,
but it's half of one
right?
branch, not one branch.
Sure, right, but it is an essential, it is a necessary but not sufficient part of the branch, right? Is that they still need to pass budgets and do things like fund the government, and that is going to be important. The House can obviously provide oversight and do kind of investigations. They can impeach Trump if they want, which they did last time, and I feel like probably they will do again.
Ooh, you heard it here first, folks. Nathaniel Rakich thinks that the Democratic House, well, 1, Democrats will win the House in 2026, and 2, that they will impeach Trump.
I just think, I kind of think that's where we're heading.
Can we just play old podcasts? For that section of it?
Yes.
We just do the whole thing that we already did over again?
I don't know if that's what you were saying, but I have made predictions on this or a similar podcast before that have not turned out to be true. But I just think that given the amount of things that Trump has done that seem unconstitutional or illegal, and it's only May, compared to his first term, it seems like Democrats will probably find they'll have something to impeach him over. And I guess it just comes down to the political will, and maybe that will have to do with like the margin in the House and whether Hakeem Jeffries is as into the idea as Nancy Pelosi was. But anyway, do I think that it matters? Yes. I think that there's still a lot of open questions about whether a lot of these executive orders obviously will hold up in court and whether it is sustainable for Trump to be a president who governs by executive order for the next 3.5 years. And even if that is the case, then a lot of those executive orders are upheld in court and the presidency becomes extremely, extremely powerful, even more powerful than it already is. There are still things I think that only Congress can do. So yes, I do think it will matter if Democrats take back the House.
Yeah, that was also more of a pot stirring question for what it's worth. I mean, we're still pretty early on in Trump's second term. And usually it takes a while to get the legislating mechanisms to actually happen. Now, this is a record low number of laws actually being passed, but presumably Republicans will come together on something. And for that, they'll need the House. We're going to leave it there for today. Nathaniel, thank you so much for joining me. Mary, also in your darkened kitchen or living room or wherever you are right now, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I'm sorry you currently don't have power. My name is Galen Druk. I'm in the early days of getting this podcast off the ground, and I appreciate your support in any way possible. Subscribe to GD Politics wherever you get your podcasts, and if you'd be so kind to rate and review us. Maybe even tell a friend about the podcast. I keep getting messages from people who are like, what happened to 538? Where'd you go? So people still don't all know that we've moved over to GD Politics. Anyway, also, importantly, subscribe to the Substack at gdpolitics.com. There you'll get updates on what we're doing, extras, and you can support this project directly. Thanks for listening, and we will see you soon.